Hi all, good evening slash afternoon slash morning slash middle of the night, and welcome to Capturing Narratives of Displacement, Divestment, and Dehumanization, the second event of this year-long oral history workshop series, Oral History and Power. My name is Carlin Liuzia. I help to coordinate the series along with Amy Starcheski, and I also instruct the accompanying course here in the Oral History Master's Program at Columbia. The concept of here seems to have sprouted many heads this year. And, you know, as I've been thinking about when I sort of sit down to write remarks for kind of introductions lately, I feel as though I'm always discovering sort of a new resonance or a new intention. And today in particular, as we begin / continue a conversation about displacement, among other things, I wanted to start by naming that at the here of Columbia University, we work on the unceded land of the Lenape people who are violently dispossessed from this place. And we honor their roots here and the strength it has taken to resist and rebuild both here and elsewhere. And as oral historians, we also acknowledge the roots of our practice in Indigenous oral history and the ways in which our field historically has excluded Indigenous peoples and practices. This acknowledgement is only the beginning of a process of building, honoring Indigenous land, people, and knowledge into our practices as oral historians for the purpose of healing, reconciliation, learning, resurgence, and the pursuit of justice. We encourage you to find your own location on this resource, which I'll put in the chat, Native Land Digital, which an OHMA alum shared with our community. And I see that some folks are already doing that, which is awesome. So I encourage you to find your location there and share it in the chat alongside your settler colonial location if you wish. And while you're doing that, I would also just like to add that this event is part of the Paul F. Lazarsfeld lecture series, and we are very grateful for that support. So welcome everyone, and welcome back to those of you who were also able to join us for our first session in the series at the end of September. For those of you who are just joining us, in the first session, Nikki Yaboa really activated our thinking around the theme of oral history and power, drawing our attention as oral historians and storytellers to the dynamic between interpersonal stories and tellings that happen at the character level, and the importance of reading across narratives for the systems that so often determine that interpersonal. So we're so excited tonight to have Sarita Daftary with us to continue this conversation, and in particular to sort of step into that systematic space as well. Sarita Daftary is a co-director of Freedom Agenda, a newly launched project at the Urban Justice Center. She worked for 3 years before that with Just Leadership USA as part of the organizing team that has the Close Rikers and Build Communities campaigns. Sarita has over 15 years of experience in community development and community organizing work in Brooklyn, including previous roles as the director of the Green Light District at El Puente in Williamsburg and the East New York Farms project director at United Community Centers. She has engaged in oral history work through the East New York Oral History Project and the Rikers Public Memory Project, and is an alumni of Oral History Summer School. Please join me in welcoming Sarita.
Thank you, Carlin. And I really appreciate starting with that land acknowledgement. Certainly the displacement that I'm going to speak of is not the first that happened on the land that is referred to as New York City now. And there's you know, a long history before that. And I'll pick up from the point of the history of East New York starting around the 60s. And then of course, the legacy of Rikers Island. So I'll be sharing some slides and trying to give us a bunch of time for listening. If we had 30 hours, I'd just get us all on here and just run through all the interviews. but we've got the time that we have tonight, and I'm really grateful I hope we'll also have a chance for people to discuss in some groups, and then also hear from each other a little bit of what comes up in your groups. I know this is a collection of folks with a lot of different intersecting experiences with oral history and work around, probably also around organizing and power. So really glad to join you all. I will share my screen now, and we'll start with this the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to. Okay, so I hope that folks are seeing a screen that says capturing narratives of divestment, displacement, and dehumanization. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about two projects that I've had the opportunity to be part of, the East New York Oral History Project and the Rikers Public Memory Project, and certainly connections between the two. The East New York Oral History Project is a collection of interviews with 19 narrators who lived in East New York in the 1960s. And it's attempting to represent the racial and ethnic diversity of people who lived in the neighborhood during that decade of rapidly shifting demographics. Just to give a little bit of a very brief oversimplification, East New York in 1960 was demographically about 80% white, and by 1970 was about 20% white and 80% people of color. So this collecting these interviews was part of an effort for me to hear from and understand and then capture and share the lived experience of that time. I got my own, sort of my roots in East New York come from urban farming. So in 2003, when I was pretty new to New York and pretty new to organizing, started working at United Community Centers in East New York as working with the East New York Farms Project. And I worked with dozens of gardeners who were stewarding these vibrant community gardens that East New York, that should be what East New York is best known for. East New York has more community gardens than any other neighborhood in New York City. Often East New York is better known for narratives about violence or other, things that don't recognize this history as much. So I was learning from these gardeners and started to understand that, sort of in learning about how they got started, what their gardens had come from. And people started to explain to me more about the history of abandonment. So this is a picture from an area that was called the Dead Zone along the L train that runs along Livonia Avenue. The 3 train that runs along Livonia Avenue. There were so many vacant lots that people converted into gardens, and it was really only through my conversations with gardeners that I understood the legacy that their gardens were built upon. And then of course that as a fairly young person doing that work with a lot to learn, I asked them and started doing, sort of my own research and learning about the sources of that abandonment. And this may be very familiar to some people, it may be less familiar to others, but basically what their stories about abandonment and divestment led me to learning about the history of redlining and the process by which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, through direction from the Federal Housing Administration, went through a process in the late 30s of classifying the risk of lending in different neighborhoods throughout the country. There was more than 200 cities that were sort of categorized by these risk maps, which now we know as redlining maps, and their justifications for describing a neighborhood as risky, or a D rating, which would then get a red mark on this map, were transparently racist and xenophobic. So these maps were accompanied by area descriptions, and this is an actual screenshot of an area description for one of the areas of East New York. So you can see what was written plainly as the explanation for why this was not a desirable area for investment or why this was risky. You'll see I know that some people may be calling in, so I'll read off what it says. It lists detrimental influences, and it says low concentration of undesirables, low-class whites and Negro. Under inhabitants, it says type laborers relief. It lists that there are foreign-born people of Italian descent. It says Negro, yes, and infiltration of that blank is filled in Negro. Relief families, very heavy. So one thing that I want to point out about this area description is the fact that Negro is a yes or no category speaks to how this process was specifically anti-Black, even as it also discriminated against people, immigrants of other racial backgrounds. So certainly this area description is classifying pretty much all immigrants, is classifying in this case Italian immigrants as undesirable, as low-class whites. But the presence of Black people was really what made the difference between a neighborhood being classified as D-rated or red and C-rated or yellow. So we'll hear more about this, through the stories, but this was certainly, I hope I just did a good job of sort of briefly walking you through my learning process about this, like just talking to gardeners and saying, talking about how they got started, and then learning about the abandoned land that they had developed this garden from, and then learning about why there was so much vacant land, and the history of racism and xenophobia and anti-Blackness that was built upon. And so I'm going to give us a chance now to listen. So we'll have 4 different clips from people who I interviewed. My plan is for us to go into breakout groups after this. So I don't think we necessarily need to use the chat function unless people feel like really moved to type something in the chat. But definitely feel free to just kind of notice what you're picking up, what you're hearing in the clips, and then you'll have a chance to discuss them in breakout groups after. We'll go through all 4 before we go to the breakout groups though. Okay, so this is Mary Barksdale that we're going to hear from.
I moved from the Bronx, and we bought our home, 365 Jerome Street. I believe my oldest son was probably around 7 or 8. It was a nice little house. It was a 2-family house. And my husband and I had planned to rent one of the apartments. I began to have stories about people just moving out, like at night. They would say that they're going to stay. But real estate people were getting people to move into this community. And even the house that I bought, I do remember, there's an elderly, older man. I think he was of Italian descent. The house was well kept, very nice. And I just didn't get the impression that he really wanted to move, but it was like a pressure thing. Not only did the people moving in get battered, but people moving out got battered as well. They got caught up with this whole thing. And real estate people were the ones that was really making the money, I didn't know anything. I was young. All I know is that I was going to be able to get a house. It's just sad because, it divides people. And it did. It was a real division. And you just think about how these things are pushed, how it's organized almost like to create this kind of conflict.
My dad got a job in the Brooklyn and Jersey City shipyards. He actually worked on 2 different shifts. And there was an enormous change in their economic circumstance because this was regular work. And my father found this house to buy on Bradford Street between Linden Boulevard and Hageman Avenue. In I think around August of '48, he bought the house for about $13,000. It was extremely difficult to get a mortgage. And the only way to get the mortgage, he said at the end of the deal, when he sort of signed the papers to get this mortgage, the banker left open the drawer. This was the ritual you went through. And my father put 5 $100 bills in the drawer as a bribe, basically, to pay the banker personally for writing this mortgage. So we moved on to this block, and the block was a very handsome block of about, I'd say, 16 or 18 sort of brick houses, 2-story brick houses with a basement. These people had survived immigration and the Depression and the Holocaust, and they had landed in East New York, and it wasn't the golden land. I mean, but it was a sanctuary. It was a refuge for them, and I think they expected it to live there forever. There were these various kinds of programs that encourage bankers and realtors to turn this neighborhood over. So the experience was one of enormous turmoil and disruption in a very relatively short period of time. My parents were, I think, the last people on the block to sell the house to a black family. My sister had already moved to the suburbs. The phone calls, my parents remember the phone calls coming all the time, and postcards. Don't be the last person on the block. You're going to lose everything. You're going to da-da-da-da. And they probably did lose something of what the house was worth. Block busting happened in part because it was understood to be the spread of Brownsville, and they knew what that was. They knew that meant deterioration. Brownsville was the place that they all came from, and Brownsville was the place that they had gotten away from. So it's race, but it's also poverty. It's your past catching up to you. But they were used to being pushed around. That was the other part of it, where they weren't shocked that that's the way the game was played. They weren't people who, I think, expected to be treated as owners. It was a kind of miracle to them that they could actually own something. There wasn't a sense that this was a larger force that was happening. This was just integrated into, well, that's just what happens to neighborhoods. They change. It's what capitalism does. It just makes you feel as though this is some kind of natural process, like a hurricane. But the more we understand about it, the more you understand that this kind of displacement, there's victims all over the place.
I'll note quickly that the sound quality on this one is going to be a little challenging, but it's important enough that we're going to try it. So apologies if it's hard to hear.
We applied for Linden houses because we had heard it was so nice, and it took a while for us to get an interview. At that time, you had to interview to get into Linden houses. And if I'm not mistaken, we interviewed twice before we were accepted. You had to be of a certain ilk, I would say. They just did not accept just anybody. I was married with 2 small children, very small. My son was an infant still, and my daughter was about 2 years old. My ex-husband, he worked for the city. Linden houses in 1962 was quite pretty, beautiful, as a matter of fact. The grounds were very well kept. There were lanterns, not lanterns, these street lamps, sort of like the ones you see in London. They were black with, the 2 bulbs on the outside, the big bulbs on the outside. The landscaping was impeccable. The guy that did our building, his name was Harold. And if you stepped into the elevator, he was either on his knees polishing the Otis elevator brass sign or the brass that went around the elevator like a handrail, or he was in the lobby polishing the windows, not washing, polishing the windows. You'd see the maintenance in the building start to change. At one time, well, before the changeover, if you had something very minuscule, I would say, let's say a knob is missing off the cabinet in your kitchen, it would be there the next day to replace that knob. As Linden got darker, the maintenance slowed way down to the point you could call with a problem with your toilet. And I remember very specifically calling because the toilet was backing up. And I was told, well, it's not an emergency. Make an appointment. We'll be there probably next week. There was no more Harold on his knees polishing the Otis elevator sign. There was no more Harold polishing the windows in the lobby. I don't remember if I told you about them coming in, taking out the radiators. They just actually took them out. And I just thought that was just so degrading. We don't deserve to have a warm hallway now. And they said it was because they wanted to keep the traffic from, congregating in the halls. Well, wait a minute, what do you mean, me and my neighbor? I think the thing that hurt the most was the feeling that you got when you had pride in your home, and then you didn't.
But people are running back now. If we were included, it would be okay. But no one's really concerned about including us. They're not really. They'll live among us and they'll tolerate us. But eventually we'll be priced out. We won't be able to afford to live next door. We can't afford to be their neighbors because there's an inequity. But on the whole, it's unfair. It really is unfair.
Okay, so that was the last of the clips, and I apologize, I forgot to read off the names for folks who are listening in but not looking at the screen. So we heard Mary Barksdale, and then we heard Richard Rabinowitz, and then Edwina Joseph and Johanna Brown spoke last in that very short clip. So what I want to do now is just give you a chance to be in groups and talk about what you heard. Really no more complicated directions than that, just to discuss what you heard in those stories, what you heard from the narrators. I think we'll spend, I'm looking at time and we're running a little bit later than what I had planned, so I think we'll probably spend like 6 minutes in these breakout groups, and then we'll have a chance to see how we can manage with a large group to hear a little bit of what you all got to discuss in smaller groups. So I think we'll go to now of those groups. And maybe I'll move on unless there's a burning, sort of comment that folks would want to share about what you heard or what you noticed. And there's actually something that I was going to share at the end, but I'll just note quickly now, is that there's actually a community land trust forming in East New York, which is really exciting to me, and I'm sure to lots of folks. I mean, a couple of some folks mentioned Richard's interview, like noting the systemic push of that it wasn't simply I mean, I've often used the term white flight, which tells part of the story, but I think tells it sort of assigns it to individual decisions or individual action or beliefs or preferences, and I think that it's important sort of that element where he also notes, as we're talking about this sort of scope of power, that people didn't expect to be treated as owners, that the Jewish communities, the Italian communities that were displaced were low-income immigrant communities. And so he, and Mary also does this, sort of puts together, the forces of capitalism and racism, capitalism and anti-Blackness, and how that played out in the willingness to destroy, and what was at that time in predominantly working class white community, that the willingness to disrupt that, with even deeper impacts on Black people who then did not have, were not shuttled off to the suburbs, did not have the opportunity to build wealth, were blocked again from the opportunity to access wealth and build wealth in New York City, as in many other places. And then there's an interview that I didn't get to play, but this could be part of the B-roll that I direct people to later. There's a man, Isaiah, who is a Black American. He moved from North Carolina to Bed-Stuy and then to East New York, where his family was able to buy a home. So they were similar to, sort of Richard's story in some ways. East New York was a refuge for them. They had been living in this cramped apartment in Bed-Stuy. They had fled racism in North Carolina and, racial oppression that was, sort of felt more in the South at that time, not that it was absent in the North. But he talks about his fears about displacement, because I was doing these interviews right around the time that the mayor announced its intention to rezone East New York, and people went from overnight from like mostly being worried about lack of investment in their neighborhood to being worried about a type of investment that was going to drive them out. And he said something in his interview that said like, he sort of said like, well, after they get all, they being the people with power, after they get all of Bed-Stuy, I guess they'll probably come out to East New York, and I suppose by then I'll just be ready to move on out. And it was really like striking to me as a memory of Richard's interview about like, this man owns his home. No, but like technically no one can make him go, right? Like he owns his home, but the lack of an expectation to be treated like an owner. And Mary, the last thing I'll say on this before we move over to talk about the Rikers Public Memory Project, Mary, among these folks, is actually the people who probably had the most like organizing grounding. So she was part of a group of folks who did a lot of organizing around school equity. And so you could hear in the way that she talks, she's saying like, she really names the systemic forces maybe most directly, like this was organized to create conflict and to push. And so even recognizing that, insisting on naming that this was not just about individual choice, because if it was just individual choice, then there's not much we can do about it. Oh, people just didn't want to live in integrated neighborhoods. But when she very directly names that this was systemic, that itself builds some power. So it was really great listening to those again with all of you, and I'll definitely think of a couple of other specific clips to direct people to. I'll move on so that we can hear about the Rikers Public Memory Project as well, and then we'll have some more time for discussion. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Let me, oops, I'm going to move this for a second. Okay. So I'll just briefly, I mentioned that this was proposed, I was doing these interviews just by chance right around the time that this proposal to rezone East New York came up, and this East New York community plan. And, I think at the time, these stories also provided a really important foundation for why people were concerned about this plan. It wasn't that people were anti-density, and it wasn't that people didn't like the idea of like this, type of, renovation of buildings. It was the fundamental inability to believe that this was for them. So we were able to use the clips in the interviews also in some of the organizing that the neighborhood coalition did to push back against that rezoning. The clips are organized on a website with a map. So that's a really a way that I would definitely recommend exploring them. So you have the website listed there. as well as they're on the Brooklyn Historical Society in their archive. So the Rikers Public Memory Project is a project that I've been really fortunate to be a part of through my organizing work, first as part of Just Leadership USA and now as Freedom Agenda. We are core partners in the group that leads the Rikers Public Memory Project. So that group includes Create Forward and the Humanities Action Lab. So together we've founded this project, the Rikers Public Memory Project, a community truth and healing process. This is an image from the one of the first events as part of the Close Rikers campaign. This was called a Mass Story Lab, facilitated by Create Forward, gathering people's stories about Rikers Island. And this project really grew out of both the campaign and that event. It's a community-based participatory initiative through which our collective stories about the impact of Rikers are activated to envision a more just New York City. For anyone who's just listening, I'll also let you know that what's on the screen right now is a map of the Rikers Island jail complex. And at the bottom, it says Rikers Island, a city in itself. So when I think about this project, I think about, capturing what kind of impact it has had on New York City and on New Yorkers to dedicate an entire island to incarceration, 400 acres. And so that's been stories that we've been capturing with this project. Sorry, there's a little bit of overlap here with the slides, so I'll have to read it out to you. So the Rikers Public Memory Project uses storytelling, art making, and oral histories to document and make visible the impact of Rikers Island by asking people, I'm gonna go back, sorry, what should we remember about Rikers? Why should we remember Rikers, and how should we remember Rikers? So I'm going to now give you a chance to listen to a clip. These clips actually are not publicly available on a website yet. We are working towards that. So this one is, I guess, particularly special because you can't find it anywhere else at the moment. But I'll give you a chance to listen. This is a clip from Gary Gordon, who was interviewed for this project. Should be able to play the clip. No. Sorry, it's probably taking a moment for the clip to load. Okay. What was it like to receive a visit on Rikers Island?
Very, very painful. For one, my mother and my ex-wife would come. Not often, but and it was painful for them. One, the nonsense you have to go through just to get into the visiting area, whether it's intentional or not. Visitors go through a lot to have a visit, whether it's to discourage, but they make it very uncomfortable for people to come see their family or their loved ones in prison. And until they aren't treated with kind of respect, or I don't know, because I never visited anyone, but my mother was elderly. I mean, my mother was almost 90 when she passed. So maybe it wasn't as bad for her because of her age. But very often people say what their family had to go through just to access the visit. But my mother, she didn't like leaving me in prison. And she would, you could see the physical change in her when it was almost time for the visit to be over, the emotional change in her. She's leaving her child in this thing. knowing the type of person I am, that I'm not going to let you just do things to me. That it was unsafe for me. I didn't physically fear anyone, but I could feel what my mother felt. And I felt so uncomfortable that I'm the reason why she's feeling this, that she's coming to see her child in prison for some nonsense. It's not like I set out to commit crimes. My crimes are the buying, possession, use of a drug. Those are my crimes. But yet I'm charged with something that so ridiculous. And see what my family goes through just to show me love, concern, even encouragement or whatever it may be, whatever positive that they could share with me. But just to see them, and it falls back on me that I'm the reason why all this is happening to them. And I can't separate myself from it when I'm the reason why it exists. So it wasn't easy going back to the housing area. And then to get back to your housing area, now you're totally dehumanized because you have to be stripped naked. And cavities are explored to see if you have any contraband. And as a person, as a man, to be stripped naked and be told to do things that you don't ask a man to do. For myself, if that was my job, I would never ask you to bend over and let me look up your butthole. That would never happen. Not for me. Okay. Get dressed, whatever. But I'm not going to dehumanize you. That you feel less than a person, less than a man, because I have just totally stripped you off naked, and I want to explore your body cavities, see if you have any contraband. I couldn't do it. If that was my job, I couldn't do it.
So actually, I apologize that I maybe should have given people a heads up that might be sort of triggering. It was a very raw and honest clip in which Gary, was speaking about his experiences. But I do want to give people a chance to, react to what you heard, and to get into breakout groups again, and just discuss for probably another. We'll do another. I think we'll do 5 minutes since we just had one clip here, but there was a lot in it. So we'll have a chance to discuss in your breakout rooms, and then we'll gather back together and hear a little bit about what you discussed. And yeah, you all brought up things that I wanted to touch on further as well. I'll just note that one thing that really sticks with me from this interview, and actually this is, I did not, the Rikers Public Memory Project Oral History Archive has more than 100 interviews, and I did not conduct most of them. I think I did a couple. There's been a really amazing team of volunteers, including Carlin and maybe some other folks on this call as well, who've been doing that. But I did conduct this interview, and something that really stuck with me, and a part of why I chose this clip, is that the multiple layers of dehumanization that he goes through, his own, what happens to his family, and even the guards, the people who seem like they might have the power in that situation, but how a person's humanity is stripped by doing that to someone else. And so, yeah, I just thought of, and because I didn't conduct, most of the interviews for this project, there's so much that I still need to absorb from listening to them that, that other people have been absorbing as they transcribe. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, so what do we do with all of these? And so I'll go to my screen. I'll go back to screen share. So the question that I want to, close out on and discuss as we close out this session is like, so what do we do now? And I feel inspired by this James Baldwin quote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think about, collecting these 100 interviews and the massive archive of harm that we've collected. But the point is to make sure that is never repeated and that we actually account for that harm. And I actually saw that my friend and colleague Wallace is on here and has a beautiful project that involves, well, I'm forgetting the name of it now, but a labyrinth, the Red Line Labyrinth, and sort of thinking through this process of like, what, so now what do we do with this information and with these, with this history? And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about, how we thought about this with this campaign. And so we did a process last summer, not last summer, summer of 2018, in which we asked people about, sort of with a frame of, we weren't using the term defund the police, but with a frame of like, how do people want to see funds that are allocated for law enforcement invested in ways that really create safety in their communities, and particularly in communities that have been subject to those decades of divestment and then subsequently blamed for that, and are now, torn apart by mass incarceration. And so we developed this platform, the Build Communities platform. And in that process, we asked people like, how did they think Rikers should be remembered? And what we heard over and over again from people who had been there, from families who'd been affected by Rikers, was like, we do not want a 400-acre monument to incarceration. We do not want an Alcatraz. We want that legacy to be actively addressed by investments in the communities that have been harmed. So the Rikers Public Memory Project and the documents we have, they give us a framework for making that reparative justice argument, to say, we have documented this legacy and this needs to be addressed. This harm needs to be accounted for. And so this was a rally at Rikers this past summer. This is just an image from the platform that we developed, the Build Communities platform, from the cover page. Within that platform, there is a reference to specifically what should happen with Rikers. And actually what people really galvanized around was the idea of transforming Rikers for green infrastructure, so that would enable the most noxious power plants in the city, the decades-old wastewater treatment plants that are polluting the South Bronx, that would enable those to close. And and to give that, for that land to be given back to communities to decide what they want to do with it, while at the same time, sort of this was something that, as I've talked to people about it, like the most transformative use that people could imagine for that island. Also because the land there is physically, environmentally toxic, in addition to the histories of trauma and torture there. There's a lot that it's not, there's a lot of other things that it's not appropriate for. And then I did want to also, just to harken back to East New York, but we already mentioned this, talk about the community land trust efforts, reclaiming land, putting land in the control of communities, and that way of really flipping the power dynamic, and how important the organizing that has come out of this is. So if we had more time, what I would want to do is really like talk with you all more about that question of what do we do. I shared a couple of answers that communities or groups or organizing efforts have come up with around, what do we do about this history, but that's certainly not, I won't present those as the definitive and full list of answers. There's a lot that we need to do. But I do want to share with you a little bit about these projects and kind of just like ways to stay connected. So there's the East New York Oral History Project. That's the website. One of the most important things folks can do to support that is just share it, share those stories, encourage people to listen to them. In addition to the map, there's a timeline that really connects people's stories to specific historical, and policy decisions. I think that can be an important teaching tool. One day I hope to build some curriculum around that. Anybody who wants to help me with that, let me know. You can get in touch with me. The Rikers Public Memory Project is still actively transcribing interviews, and we are also still actively working to close Rikers Island. And so I'm also including the website for Freedom Agenda, because it's through the campaign. The Rikers Memory Project provides this really important resource for the campaign to draw from, to make these reparative justice arguments, to make sure that we get Rikers to the point of closure, and that we also get the next essential piece of addressing the harm. And then my email address is there as well, so that folks can stay in touch. I'll take this off screen share, and there may be some things that people want to throw in the chat. We're like right at 7:30. I can stay on a little longer, but I know that we had planned to end at 7:30.
Sarita, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to hear you share about these projects, and also, as I mentioned during one of the breakout rooms, just to be listening in community simultaneously is really special. So thank you all as well for being here and present and doing that listening together, and sharing your reflections. And also sharing all of this knowledge and all these great resources. As I said, we'll be sure to compile those. For any who do have to dash right away, I do just want to remind you that our next workshop event, Empowering Youth Through Indigenous Stories, is on Thursday, November 5th. And Sarita, I'm so glad you brought up curriculum at the end, right? And that as potentially a next step. Sarah Sinclair and Suzanne Methot will be talking about how they built curriculum out of Sarah's collection, How We Go Home, which just came out this week, if anyone wants to check that out before the event. But they'll be talking about how to create educational materials from oral histories towards challenging oppressive power dynamics, creating power among youth, and it should be really great. So thank you again so much, Sarita, and to you all for being here. I'm happy to stay on as well if folks want to hang out and ask additional questions, but for any who have to leave, thank you so much. I've mentioned this in a couple private messages, but we recorded the session, but as with our oral history interviews, we sort of wait till the end of things to talk about consent in terms of sharing out further. So Sarita and I will have that conversation in terms of what will happen with the recording, but thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all and to share those interviews.
Sarita, we do have a question in the chat from Greta that reads, I'd love to hear more about the process behind the interviews, nuts and bolts types of stuff. A few questions off the top of my head are, what kinds of preparatory work, relationships/trust building, etc. did interviewers do with narrators leading up to the interview itself? How did you decide which interviewer should pair with which narrator? How were narrators compensated for their time and sharing their experiences? Similar to the reciprocity question that we talked about in the class conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can answer that. I'll answer first for the East New York Oral History Project because it's a little bit maybe more straightforward. I really started with people that I knew, people that I knew through community gardening organizing in East New York, or people that I knew through United Community Centers where I had worked, and they introduced me to other people. And that, I sort of got to about 19 people pretty quickly, just doing that. I was doing that in a completely volunteer capacity, as an interviewer, and the narrators were also volunteering their time. And I made sure that they each got a copy of the interview. I was telling some folks before who were in the class portion that laughably, I was giving people CDs. This was like 5 years ago, and that still seemed relevant. But a lot of the folks were older and appreciated having that. And for the Rikers Public Memory Project, we do have Regina Campbell on as well, who's been the project lead over the past year or so, and really through the bulk of the archive collection. There was like a few of us kind of patching it together before we brought in Regina. So I ended up, in most cases, that's not true. I mean, when I interviewed people, in some cases I interviewed people that I already knew. And Regina might even want to weigh in a little bit more, since she's overseen so much of this process, about trust gathering and reciprocity.
Thank you, Sarita. You did a wonderful presentation. And as far as the relationship building, one of the things that was really important for us with this project was partnering with organizations that work with people that or have members or client or staff that were impacted by Rikers. And we did the interviews on their location. This is pre-COVID, right? So we would go to the spaces where they would already naturally go to. And so we eliminated the barrier of trying to find a new spot, new location. I think early on, some of the interviews were conducted at the library, but over the last year, they've been directly with their partners, so whether that was Fortune Society, Bronx Freedom Fund, Exodus Transitional, we went there. So that was one way to establish a relationship. And we used the partners to make those connections. So we didn't have any interviews where we were cold calling people to have them come in and tell their stories. We had someone that had a personal relationship with them, contact them. And so I think that gave a comfort level. We also shared with them information about what to expect before they came in. So they knew what, and they also got to see the questions beforehand. So they came in with an understanding of what they were getting into, some, in some form or fashion. Sometimes they would have no knowledge, but just the fact that they were invited by somebody they trusted went a long way in being able to establish a connection. And then also, I think having multiple points of contact. So I was there to greet them as well as somebody they knew. And then, and Carlin can speak to this as well because she did a number of interviews, but we were very intentional about, before we just went in and started asking a bunch of questions that were really personal and could be triggering, making sure that they felt comfortable in their space, they felt comfortable with what was about to happen, had the opportunity to ask any questions. And after we've completed the interview, we were very intentional about having a self-care piece and making sure that they were okay with what they just experienced and we didn't just send them out the door with, okay, thank you, have a nice day. So, and we were even able to continue that when we collected our interviews virtually after COVID. So there was a lot of intentionality behind the process of collecting the interviews. Compensation, we did not have any compensation early on, but post-COVID, or I guess we're in COVID still, but we did start compensating some of our narrators, especially any narrator. We realized towards the end that there was a demographic that we were missing, so we were trying to target a particular demographic that was where the gaps in our stories were. So we did compensate some of those narrators, as well as we interviewed, I think, about 20 people that were recently released from Rikers as a result of COVID, and they were staying at hotels in the city, and they really needed some type of compensation. So we were able to put together some money, shift things in our budget so that we can compensate them with an honorarium. So I hope that answers the questions.
Thank you, Regina. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot. I was like, well, Regina's here. One thing I just wanted to add, because I noticed that Michelle O'Brien is speaking in this series as well about the Trans Oral History Project. And we met with Michelle and actually collaborated with the Trans Oral History Project on collecting some interviews of trans folks who had experienced Rikers. And it was really interesting to hear a difference in some of the considerations they had versus ours. So Michelle mentioned that that in a lot of cases, the trans community has been sort of like hyper studied, and there was both like resistance around that and also just like a need to approach that more carefully and think about, and they compensated selectively for their project also, like to, to sort of fill gaps. And it was helpful to hear from them about how they thought through that. In our case, I mean, setting up an interview and just getting people to like commit to a time and be there and like all, I mean, there's just like challenges generally about that. But overall, what we found, and I think I have heard, Regina echo this too, is that interviewing people about Rikers, like so many people have these stories that they haven't been able to tell, that like that they have I don't know, I feel like an innate sense, like this is the story that people need to know. And when you are incarcerated, you aren't believed. I mean, particularly at Rikers, right? You're like, people are there while they're awaiting trial. So they're in this setting where they're always discredited by the guards, and like nothing they say is heard or believed. And then they go to court, which is also another setting where you're basically silent and there's just like lawyers talking about you. And so people have these like deep experiences that I think they actually want them to be recorded. And I've had experiences with just my, friends and coworkers from my work organizing around closing Rikers, where someone will tell me a story about Rikers, and I realize, like, I've known you for 2 years and you're just telling me this now. Like, people have layers and layers of stories about torture, essentially. It's been a site of torture for 80 years and it still is. People are on Rikers right now. And so I think we just maybe found like an eagerness to actually be heard on the record about what those experiences were, that maybe isn't the case for all projects.
And I think the other thing that I noticed, and Sarita, I know you experienced this, but not every narrator has the same outlook about what should happen with Rikers too. There were actually quite a few narrators that felt like, Rikers shouldn't close and that it wasn't as bad as people thought. So just even hearing those different perspectives, I think added a different dimension to the project that I don't think initially anticipated.
One thing that I heard over and over, and those questions that Sarita shared, the sort of project level questions, were at the end of the interview guide. They were sort of like, make sure that we ask everybody these questions. What do we need to remember about Rikers? How and who needs to hear your story and why? And I think maybe every single interview that I did, and also the ones that I've been transcribing a bit this summer, I think almost every narrator said, everyone needs to hear my story. Like, there was none of the, sometimes in oral history, like, very much wanting to keep consent kind of constant and at the fore, and not wanting to re-traumatize narrators talking about difficult things. We kind of worry that we're going to be putting them in a position that they don't want to be in. And there were times when narrators said, no, I don't want to talk about that. And so they very much maintained that authority throughout the interviews, but without fail, they all said, everyone needs to hear this story.
I think we've covered the questions that were in the chat, and thanks to folks that were able to hang on a little bit longer. It was really, really valuable for me to hear from you in the bits that we could. I know that it's challenging with a large group. There's never as much discussion as we would like there to be, but really appreciate folks sharing and listening together and just joining for this conversation.
Thank you for staying on, Sarita. And thank you all also. A wonderful number of people have been able to share this extra 15 minutes of conversation. Thank you all again so much. Hopefully see you in a month for the November 5th event with Sarah and Suzanne, talking about curriculum and sort of how the now what question, they have a very particular answer and approach to that, which should be super interesting. And as Sarita said, share these projects more widely, continue to listen, continue to have this conversation. Yeah, thanks so much.